This episode of Rusophiles Unite is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional cinema from around the world. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film, each one thoughtfully handpicked, from new directors to award winners. Beautiful, interesting, incredible movies, there's always something new to discover. Right now on Mubi, you can watch Sergei Loznitsa's State Funeral, a stunning archival vision of the Soviet Union in the days after Joseph Stalin's death, and the subject of this episode of the show. To try Mubi free for 30 days, you can visit mubi.com/Rusophiles. That's mubi.com/Rusophiles for an entire month of incredible cinema free of charge.
Tatiana, hear me.
Вот скажи мне, американец, в чем сила?
А вы что, собираетесь на ней жениться?
Да.
Ух, красота-то какая, лепота.
Таможня дает добро.
И вообще не называй меня, пожалуйста, Вероника. Кто я? Вот кто я?
Отныне русская земля единый быть.
Don't torture me, I can't live without him.
Hi, my name's Ali, and this is the Rusophiles Unite podcast, where we watch Russian films and films with a Russian connection. As always, I am joined by a guest, and today my guest is Kristaps Andrejsons. Hi, Kristaps. Thanks very much for joining me.
Greetings, comrade.
Thank
you for having
that you're
me.
using the traditional Eastern border greeting. Yeah, no, it's a delight to finally get you on the show. So, for folks who haven't come across the Eastern border, tell us a little bit about yourself, Kristaps.
Well, I'm a podcaster from Latvia. I live literally on the Eastern border, normally, literally 20 kilometers from the Russian border. And we used to be in the Soviet Union. You might have heard of that country at some point.
Yeah, it comes up once or twice on this show.
So what I do is I try to make a podcast about how it was really like to live in the country there, and also have branched out due to listener requests into talking about various other historical subjects concerning Russia and all the Eastern European region in general, sometimes talking about Balkans as well, where I visited, and then I have to talk about Russian politics now and then.
I was going to say, current affairs as well, because
I have to make an episode on that each month because I truly feel that sometimes people from the Western countries and journalists there, they just get the gist from third-party sources or something, and there's a lot of content which is exclusively in Russian, and I follow all the Russian opposition media, and I want to bring out some true stories from that as well. So my show is all about the Soviet history and modern-day Russian politics, but not in the boring sense of traditional news, because I tend to cherry-pick my stories to make it actually interesting. Meanwhile, it's also it's also quite depressing sometimes, but then again, what isn't?
That's the spirit. Yes. I think if you have an interest in history and or politics, especially right now, you kind of have to have like a pretty high, I guess, depression / sadness tolerance level built up. I don't even know what that is, but yeah. So what inspired you to start the podcast then, Kristaps?
It started out in my back room, and I was listening to Dan Carlin. Everyone listens to Dan Carlin, really. And then he had his forums back in the day, before he kind of had to shut him down. And I was a history student, so what I did was I collected a bunch of stories about how it was like to serve in the Soviet army, various stories from the people there, and they seemed kind of, a bit crazy now and then and interesting. So I just posted kind of a blog there on those Dan Carlin forums. And then Mr. Dan himself told me that, hey, why don't you make your own podcast? And that was back in, 5 years ago at this point, where podcasts were just appearing and growing, and there weren't as many independent podcasters. So I grew up from there, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think many people, certainly in the kind of history/politics side of things, indie podcasters will have been inspired by Dan Carlin. In fact, a previous guest, going back way to my first series, a guy called Patrick, he actually introduced me to Dan Carlin's podcast, way back when I was still living in Russia. I think I was just home for the summer. So yeah, that really, his show very much kind of put me onto more independent podcasting. Prior to that, I'd just been listening mostly to stuff from the BBC, if I'm honest, that was essentially just podcast versions of radio shows.
I also listen to the BBC show. My favorite one is the history one. What's its name with the awesome journalist guy? In Our Time History. That one.
Okay, I was gonna say, yeah, because I am a big fan of In Our Time. In fact, it was funny. It's funny because it's so long running. Actually, showbiz gossip. But just over a year ago, through my day job, I actually went to the Parliamentary Book Awards. It was just in that window before COVID arrived in the UK. Well, there was probably some cases at that point, but things hadn't shut down. So this was actually in person. And I stood next to Melvin Bragg, the host, very briefly. I did not pluck up the courage to actually say hi, because I just was like, what would I even say? And he's probably just, trying to enjoy his evening. So I completely wimped out of that. But that is my showbiz anecdote. But yeah, big fans of that show over here. It's so wide ranging and cool.
Podcasts are like Pringles. You can't have just one.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as far as the eastern border, we've mentioned the history and the current affairs side of things. Do you have personal favorites in terms of ones that you've made?
Oh yeah, I really dug deep into the Chernobyl series. Well, it was one of the first episodes I made. I guess it was 10th or something, which I enjoyed. And then, as I gained access to other sources, I revisited Chernobyl after the TV show came out, which I enjoyed immensely. And at that point, kind of more documents were basically made public again, because in Russia and in all our countries, a lot of the Soviet-era documentation is still under the seal of secrecy, and you can't access it. So that came out, and I was stunned, because the whole incompetence in building the whole reactor and everything, people knew about it, you see. And it's a rare case, a rare story where I have to say that the KGB guys were the good, responsible people in that story, which doesn't come up often. But yeah,
no.
they were Andropov himself was basically at that point yelling at people, saying that you can't build it like this. Come on, it's a nuclear reactor. Just fix it up. And no one did. But even back then, as it was built, there were a bunch of people from the KGB literally writing to the Central Party Committee saying, hey, guys, please fix this. And no one did. So that stunned me. So that's one of my best personal stories. And the other one I have to mention is that, you might have heard of a nice little affair called the Russian-Afghanistan War, the Soviet-Afghanistan War.
Yeah, which for them is, for those who don't know, it's pretty much to the Soviet Union what the Vietnam War was to the Americans.
Yeah, and those veterans are still alive, but it was all top secret, and I spoke with them, and that was one of the more tragic experiences ever, one of the more personal stories where I felt connection with those people and how they were treated and everything. That was a kind of a grim affair. But then we have fun episodes too about the Soviet space program and animals and farming in the Soviet Union, which is quite probably the most dark episode around. But you should listen to that. I don't want to spoil anything about that.
That counts as a fun episode.
Well, it crosses the line at least 5 times in every 10 minutes or so.
I mean, in terms of the intersection between funny and dark, you did one episode with, what's his name? The chap who's written the book about Soviet jokes.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
Editor's note. The name of the book that I was totally drawing a blank on there is It's Only a Joke, Comrade. Humour, Trust and Everyday Life Under Stalin, 1928 to 1941, by Jonathan Waterlow. And it just so happens that if you're in the UK, you can pick the book up from our bookshop.org affiliate store, and we get a cut of the sale. So, yeah, you can find the link in the show notes. Anyway, back to the show. So I was wondering if you could share with us some of your favourite, like, Stalin-era jokes or jokes about Stalin, particularly because of the film we'll be talking about on this episode.
Yeah, I have a bunch written down because they're mostly from the Armenian radio kind, and Armenian radio was a fun program where it was kind of a morning talk show, and people could call in and ask questions. So that made into the political atmosphere. So the jokes are basically Armenian radio gets called, they get a question, and then they answer in a meaningless way. So I have 3 jokes for you prepared. 2 of them are the Armenian radio one, and one is about movies. So
I was going to say shoot, but again, considering we're talking about Stalin, maybe that's in poor taste.
Why shoot? Use ice pick instead. Save bullet. Okay, Armenian radio gets asked, how will we find out that there's, the communism has finally arrived? Armenian radio answers, well, they'll probably tell you in the radio and newspapers, and if the people will still have TVs remaining, then they'll say that there as well. And another one is, Armenian radio gets asked, will there be KGB under communism? Armenian radio answers, well, I think by that time people will have learned to rest themselves. And then there's the movie joke. In Leningrad, just right next to the Winter Palace, goes kind of a shoot of a movie about the whole storming of the Winter Palace, and the Bolsheviks are attacking, and the cadets and Junkers are just shooting back, and there's kind of a bunch of extras, and somewhere from the crowd someone screams, hey, Junkers, fight until the last man! Fight until the last man!
Yeah, I suspect things didn't end well for that particular audience member. And very good for bringing in a film-related joke. I appreciate that. Keeping it on topic, that's good.
Keeping on topic? Oh, okay. We can do that.
No, we can go on tangents.
No, it's totally fine. But as usual, I have to warn people who listen to shows with guests on them. On topic tends to be a very sliding scale, really. In any show where there's more than one where there's more than one person speaking, it always becomes somewhat of a sliding scale affair.
But that's the whole fun, is just seeing where the conversation goes. Yeah. So I should bring in the movie that we're going to be watching. So the movie we're going to be watching is called State Funeral, and it's a 2019 documentary by Ukrainian director Sergei Loznitsa. As I say, he's Ukrainian, but his Russian connection is that he studied in, I don't know whether you pronounce it VGIK or whether it's just VGIK, but it's like the big film school in Moscow. So yeah, that's his Russian connection. It is about the funeral of Joseph Stalin. So yeah, let's talk about that guy.
VGIK stands for Всероссийский государственный институт кинематографии, or All Russian State Cinematography Institute.
Yes, although as it happened in the Soviet Union,
it was all Soviet at that time. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, people came from all around the Union, and it's a funny phenomenon that I've noticed in terms of women who were directors, is that a lot of the best Soviet directors who were women weren't ethnic Russians. They were from the various different republics. So so I want to cover more films directed by women, but a lot of them I'm kind of like, am I kind of co-opting somebody who's not really Russian? So I have to like find the connection. So
look,
that I'm not
it's actually very simple because during the Soviet era, there was, at least when it came to art and all that stuff, we really didn't, at that time it was a single country, and people truly kind of, we still today, in other places in Europe, you use English as your, when you meet a person from another country, you can probably speak English to them. Meanwhile, in all of the post-Soviet bloc sphere, Russian serves the same purpose. We all
it's the
we all
lingua
do
franca,
that. Yeah. So, basically, kind of Russian per se is just one of the things, because kind of the cultural attitudes, I think, including in film, are quite similar around these parts. And, well, some of the films are just downright scary, too. I mean, one of my favorite ones, where some people from Latvia also participated, was the one about the hedgehog in the fog.
Oh, I love that film.
It's weird
so
for
beautiful.
a kids movie, though. It is pretty dark if you look at it, and it's
It is, yeah.
And that's one of those few movies. I know. I don't want to sound pretentious here, but that's one of the things that you could possibly describe as dreamlike.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I definitely need to cover Yuri Norstein's animations on this show at some point. Don't worry, listeners, it is on the to-do list.
Okay, today's movie. We have to get to today's movie.
Yeah, we do. But we have to talk about Uncle Joe a little bit
why?
first.
But why?
Well, because we're ushering him off his mortal coil. He's shuffling off
nice.
it.
Let's talk about Old Koba then. A huge fan of movies, by the way. He loved
well,
stuff.
indeed. Like those of you who've heard our episode on Chapayev, he watched that. I forget. It's either 40 times or close to it. Like he just watched that thing again and again.
And he used his power to basically control which director should direct the movie and how the actors should act. He totally liked to kind of micromanage stuff, and he would just call in actors into him and just say, no, you can't act this character in this way. It's like, you have to do it differently. He was just really into that, and it's kind of weird because.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just saying that he was a huge movie buff, which is interesting to me because he also liked the classical westerns a lot. That's one of his things.
Yeah, I'd heard that. And one of the things they cover in the British/American movie Death of Stalin is his late night film screenings, that he was quite the night owl and would keep all of his immediate underlings up until the wee hours in the morning watching a movie. And, you don't really feel like you can turn around to Joseph Stalin and say, do you know what, I think I'm just going to have an early night.
No, also he made people drink at those events and drink heavily because of his all prison stuff, because he used to sit in prison for a lot of times and escape a lot of prisons. And he learned from that prison culture that's how he kind of tested if we can trust someone, because he knew that a lot of people get extremely talkative when they're drunk.
Oh, they do, yeah.
So he used, and if you couldn't drink with him, and he was, let's just say, tough. He could drink a lot. And then he would just make people drink a lot, and then if they would say something stupid, then off to Gulag you go.
Right, yeah. Or he would just remember it for later, and just... Maybe there would be a 6-month or 3-year delay, and then this thing that you said would come back.
Yeah, and because obviously it was taped to hell and back. All of it. There were always like tapes and everything. And he just would run with that. So, but he was an interesting person, truly, because he, as you might have known, he studied to become a Orthodox priest for a while.
Right.
But then he found Karl Marx and became an atheist. And he never came from like a rich family or something. But then he got involved into all of this Bolshevik stuff, and he planned a lot of terrorist acts and crimes to steal money for Bolsheviks and whatnot. But he had a soft spot for a while, at least, because he was also he was trying to be, this cultured person, but he suffered a lot as his contemporaries of the time, Lenin and Trotsky, came from much kind of well-off families. They were not from peasant stock, so to speak. Not to offend anyone here, I just don't know how to express it better. So he was always treated as this simpleton or something, but he really tried at some point. So he, later in his life, after his wife died, just after his first wife, after just a year of marriage, he wrote himself that any warmth he has ever had left him completely. And then he became way more brutal. This is the moment where Koba, this whole Georgian folk hero, turns into Stalin himself. And after that, although he enjoyed art a lot, he also had this kind of contempt for the people whom he would consider, people from the high art societies and all that stuff. He basically would, make them feel, he would punish them essentially because he would associate with the fact that as he wasn't in power, those people would kind of laugh at him and put him aside and not allow him to participate in everything. So that's also his attitude towards art. He really wanted to enjoy it, but he had a bit of that. That's why he also micromanaged all the actors in a lot of movies, because he wanted to put like people from simpler backgrounds, so to speak, true proletarians in there, because he thought that maybe high art people, real Shakespearean actors, he viewed them with suspicion and thought they were, too much like into themselves or something.
Just
kind of like that.
Snobby bourgeoisie, essentially.
Yeah, and he basically always tried to be as simple as it gets, because if you look at his pictures, like he had a fancy mansion, multiples of, and he, like, in his spare time, if you read biographies, then he enjoyed life and he liked, drinking and partying sometimes, but he always in public only wore his coat and like his only one, like, Medal of Honor, the hero of the Soviet Union one, and he always dressed kind of in plain clothes, and well, he always tried to be this prude person, and he had no patience for kind of generals or someone decorating themselves way beyond their merits and stuff like that. So that's an interesting aspect of his psychology. I hope it's relevant to this. I just want to kind of, if we're looking this about Stalin, I think people should kind of know about the person himself.
Yes, I mean it sounds kind of gross to say that he's a fascinating figure because he was a brutal tyrant and murderer, but it is a very interesting story of how somebody comes from obscurity to be like one of the most powerful men in the world.
Yeah, and the fact is that his character was so strong that now everyone automatically assumes that the general secretary is the leader of the Soviet Union in all the histories, right? But
which
the fact is,
was not set in stone.
It was not the case. It was not the case at all, because Stalin made the position rather than the position took Stalin in. Because at the beginning, he actually was just general secretary, kind of the chief clerk of everything. But he was responsible for all the human resources and where which people worked and stuff, so he built his team from there.
Yeah. And talking about people writing him off, Trotsky particularly essentially just thought of Stalin as a pen pusher who just wasn't that important. And yeah, I get the impression that he wasn't kind of, it's just an odd way to describe it, but he wasn't flashy like Trotsky. Like, Trotsky was very charismatic in a big way. Like, he could give big, inspiring speeches, which apparently Stalin really wasn't so good at.
Stalin was the planner guy. He did it from the ground up. He was the guy who does all the legwork, basically. And that's how he got in power, because everyone was so concerned at that time about the charismatic speeches and popularity that they just didn't notice the fact that Stalin had basically infiltrated himself and put his people in all parts of the government and built his agencies and networks everywhere. So when it came to, they could have their nice little speeches all they wanted, but then if they did something that would disturb Stalin and mess him up on his way to power, then he could just remove them easily, so to speak.
Yeah. He quietly co-opted all the practical levers of power. I mean, it seems from listening to your series on him, Man of Steel, you said the word network, he was essentially this brilliant networker, and apparently he had a very good memory for names and faces, and was just on an individual level, again, I feel like I have to really underline this because I don't want to sound more sympathetic to the guy than I am, because he was horrible.
He's just extremely fascinating in a way that, I might use a gaming analogy here, from Dungeons and Dragons or something, because there's this alignment system there. You can be either lawful or chaotic or good or evil, and then it creates kind of a grid, lawful good, lawful neutral, chaotic good, stuff like that. If we're talking about villainous people in history, then I would consider that for example, Hitler is chaotic evil. Meanwhile, Stalin is more lawful evil person. He's fascinating in the sense that he was all about this organizing and power and all these structures, and kind of like Winston Churchill, except extremely, extremely evil and power hungry, sort of like that. I'm not an expert on British history, but
yeah, don't open the Churchill can of worms. Really don't. Yeah. I mean, he was just like it seems like when he wanted to be, he was extremely personally charming, like, and just able to convince people that he wasn't a bad dude, and that, like, in terms of like underlings and people who were beneath him in the party, like, he would flatter them, like, by remembering who they were, and so he just had a way of convincing people that supporting him was in their own interest. I mean, it turns out that often backfired pretty spectacularly for them, but he just was like a master manipulator.
And at the same time, he was extremely ruthless, because he himself, like, when his son, as a kid, asked him, "Hey, Dad, can I be Stalin too one day?" Then he brushed him off by saying that, "I'm not Stalin, you're not Stalin, there's only one Stalin," and that's, his crafted image. And what really underpins his whole ruthlessness is the fact that his son, from his now deceased wife, he fought in World War II, and he was a lieutenant, and he got captured by the Germans.
Sure, yeah.
And then the Germans found out that he was Stalin's son,
and they thought they could use him as leverage.
To basically exchange him for some captured higher rank officers. And there was this nice line that Stalin replied that he will not exchange a lieutenant for a colonel, and just didn't care at all. So Stalin's son ended up, basically, when he heard the news, he got into a massive depression and basically kind of committed suicide. He ran into electric wires and was then shot by the guards. Stalin shed no tears over that. Yeah, just to show you the extremes of this personality. I mean,
like,
it's kind of
levels of callousness. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because we're not being sympathetic here for his vast amounts of crimes. However, you have to admit that he's definitely earned his place in history as a kind of a fascinating personality. I mean, you can look at other historical figures such as Genghis Khan and Julius Caesar, for example.
I think both of those guys, there are similarities in terms of, like, just having immense, like, personal gifts and kind of a genius of a kind, but also just having, like, zero regard for other human lives.
Yeah, and it's like we're not saying that they were awesome guys and you should replicate them, but there's a little something that I think that you can, learn by reading their biographies and learning about them. That definitely is the case.
I mean, not least for the fact that evil people don't always look like, they often come across as quite charming and lovable.
I mean, Stalin, if you look at him now, Stalin comes off as a textbook sociopath.
Right.
I don't really even think he understood the concept of any morality or empathy in general. I think those words would mean like nothing to him. He could fake it, but I personally believe that he had this idea of empathy for other people as something other people might have, and that being their weakness or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could definitely make the case for that. Yeah. All right, so I think we could probably safely say that we could talk about Stalin a lot more, but let's cease talking about him and let's bury him. We should get on with the film.
Music to my ears, man.
Right, yes. So, what we say at this point in every episode is Поехали. And Kristaps, what does that mean?
Oh, that literally means let's go, which is a famous phrase used by Gagarin upon his first flight. It's a very iconic statement, and I'm happy that we're using it here.
Awesome. So, 3, 2, 1.
Поехали.
Joseph Stalin скончался.
And we're back. Kristaps Andrejsons and I have just watched State Funeral, directed by Sergei Loznitsa. And before we tell you what we thought about it, this is not a narrative film, so it's not really a plot summary, but Kristaps is going to give us an overview of what we see in this film. So if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want to have it spoiled, sounds weird talking about that in our historical documentary, but be that as it may, this is where Kristaps will be talking about what happens. So yeah, over to you, Kristaps.
Well, this is a collection of various archive footage of what happened during Stalin's death, and it takes you through the whole process. And the archive footage is mostly unseen, and it just goes through all of the funeral procedure, through the fact that how Stalin's death is announced to the public, and how people react, and how people basically buy up newspapers to read more on this. And then there is the funeral, the preparation, and then there's the funeral itself, and people enter, and there's kind of the whole procedure, everything, and then there's a parade, and there's a lot of speeches. It goes through a long list of everything that happened through the funeral in various parts of the Soviet Union, and how people reacted, and it's a slow movie, and the most important part about this, I think, is not exactly, it goes through it very chronologically. You can clearly see through from the beginning to the end of everything, but it shifts its focus, and it doesn't happen in one spot. It happens like through various places in time, and focuses on various different aspects. For example, there's just before the funeral, in the preparation phase, there's also this kind of scene where all the foreign delegations arrive from the Soviet bloc, and there's Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria, and then there are people's representatives, and they come to say their goodbyes to Stalin, and a lot of speeches are given. If you're fluent in Russian, they're going to be amazing. It goes through that. It's kind of hard to describe because, well, if you've ever kind of imagined how a state funeral would go through from a perspective of watching it at the sidelines and just filming through how people react and how guests arrive and how speeches are given, then that's that basically. And it's more I think about the people inside the whole story rather than about the story itself. At least that's how I observed it. And it's like it's every stage of this funeral. It's not chaptered, but you can see it like announcement, early stages, and everything. Every stage is very, very thorough, and you get to see a lot of perspectives on the same aspects happening all the time.
That was a great summary, Kristaps. Thank you.
I hope it was, because it's not easy to give everything this exact description. Because there's so much, and there's so many like little details, and it is kind of repetitive. And it's worth saying there's no commentary. There's music, and when people are giving speeches and when announcements are happening over the tannoy, you hear that, but you don't get any, like, there's not a director or an actor, like, reading a voiceover or explaining things. You just see it and you hear it. And then at the very end of the film, you have some title cards basically giving you a summary of Stalin's crimes. See, I found the fact that there's no commentary to be at least I viewed it as an interesting artistic decision here, because I watch a lot of documentaries, and at this point when, specifically in Russian, and most of these commentaries have this video background with some people commenting, but at one point you truly have seen all the stock footage from that era, and you just basically just listen to the commentary as a kind of a podcast. But in this film, the fact that there is no commentary puts focus on the very images on the screen. You have to watch it because it's less about, like I said, the whole events are there in the back, but it's more about the people's reactions. It's kind of like this people's story because it focuses on the common people a lot and the very, like, their faces and their expressions, and it gives you this feel. it's meant to be seen and absorbed in a more of a visual way, because some of the speeches, for example, they also don't have an excellent audio quality because it's archive footage, but it's set up nicely and edited together so that it would be very chronological. And this shift of perspectives also forces you to basically watch through it and pay attention to all these visual cues and details.
Yeah, I mean, it feels very much like a primary source rather than a secondary source. I mean, you have to not be naive in the sense that there's a director involved and they're selecting the footage, and apparently this was taken from like over 200 hours worth of footage that they've like cut down and assembled. Okay, a quick correction here. I made a mistake. It wasn't 200 hours of footage. It was actually 40. I think what happened here is that there were 200 camera operators working, and I conflated this number with the number of hours of footage. So yeah, anyway, thought I should correct that. And now back to my conversation with Kristaps. And, you know, there's editing, of course, and there's sequencing. But as we say, it's quite chronological. And so there's editorial decisions, if you like. But it isn't mediated by having somebody explaining stuff. The only kind of editorial you get is those title cards at the end, as I've mentioned. So I've got a quote from the director, which I'd normally not do, but I think this is quite illustrative. So, quote, "It's crucial for me to bring the spectator inside this experience, not as an impartial observer of a historical event or an admirer of rare archival footage, but as a participant and a witness of a grandiose, terrifying, and grotesque spectacle, revealing the essence of a tyrannical regime," end quote. So, yeah, I think that's a great quote. But, Kristaps, do you feel like the director achieved what he set out to in, like, bringing you as the viewer into the event, like, as if you were there?
Yes, and I think that was also one of the reasons why there was no commentary. Because
definitely.
And there were the specific point where I felt really put into all this situation is how you get the kind of the viewpoint and the camera and kind of the parts from all this archive footage chosen is very much chosen to make you feel like you're standing there and you're not put into a specific spectator position. For example, when there's a scene where people are buying Pravda newspaper to learn about Stalin's death, you feel like one of the people in the crowd.
Yeah. Rather than having that distance.
Yeah. There is no distance, and there are some establishing shots, obviously, so that you understand where things are happening. But for the most part, everything feels like you're there. Then again, that's my personal opinion here, and as I'm not a movie expert, so.
No, and that was very much my experience. And I found it's very weird because, of course, you know, with any movie, you bring your, like, own experiences and your own knowledge to the table. But I felt like it was just like this weird dissonance because you've got this music playing throughout and it's kind of like the great, like, funereal, like, music pieces, so it's very moving, you know, and there's like a Mozart piece at one point which I also like know from it's used at the end of L.M. Klimov's Come and See, but that's kind of like another matter entirely. But this, you know, you've got all this incredibly moving music, just seeing human faces like with tears and just everyone like really sad. I found like I was feeling sadness, even though, like, at the same time, cognitive dissonance, because I'm not sad that Stalin is dead. He was a horrific tyrant, but just the effect of this somber music and these, like, grieving people, just, like, you can't help being, or at least I couldn't help being sucked in by that. Yeah. It's really an odd experience.
Yeah, about the sadness part and the somber music there, it's kind of a twofold thing, because there were quite a lot of people who genuinely grieved for Stalin, but there were a lot more who were mostly afraid that if they were afraid because at this point in history in the Soviet era, one of the observers that you could take place in this movie is that of a KGB agent who's there to take notes if you're not grieving well enough, and then you can sometimes spot kind of the fear on some people's faces there and all kind of the theatrical parts. So I think that is also part of the thing, because a lot of people didn't know what would happen next and what was going on and who was watching them. But it's you could kind of describe it as having a similar mood to a good psychological horror movie in a way, because it gives you this mood, and it's not a happy mood at all. It's kind of this thick atmosphere, where you could basically hang an axe there in the air basically all the time. This movie is not an easy watch, basically. You can't just, sift through it. You have to dedicate yourself to watching through this and to try to understand it as best as you can, I think. Definitely.
Yeah, no, it's not an exciting film in a conventional way at all. And it's not a hard watch necessarily in terms of seeing awful things, because, it's mostly just like people filing into buildings and filing out of them. I mean, you see a dead body, obviously. But
just one though.
But just one. But it's just the knowledge of the context and who it is who is being mourned and the things that he was responsible for. It's just like, yeah, it's quite a creepy feeling. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. I don't know what you felt about the decision to omit from the ending title cards the fact that over the days of the official mourning, a lot of people actually died due to essentially like crowd control, like management issues, and just incompetence. And just, that's horrific, but it's just completely omitted from the film, possibly just because they wanted to focus on the spectacle. But just for listener context, this is a quote from Joshua Rubinstein's The Last Days of Stalin. So, quote, "No one can say for sure how many people died in the streets of Moscow during those days of mourning. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties," end quote. So, yeah, what did you think of the decision not to talk about that aspect of the process of? I mean, it sounds callous to say the process, but the events.
It kind of feels like a process indeed, and I think that, well, in a way, it kind of reinforced the idea that the spectator is another character in the movie, and that reinforced my idea that he would be the one from the KGB part. Why it wasn't mentioned at the end, well, yeah, I have no idea really, because, well, it would be fitting for the fact that this whole story and everything, obviously it was all footage taken from propaganda channels in the Soviet Union.
Sure.
And this whole funeral was presented in a way as a kind of a biased source would sort of present it, maybe. I can only give opinions there and some thoughts on this, but I have no clue. I found it a bit strange, but it's hard to quite well understand and how this whole process worked.
No, that's totally fair enough.
Oh, also, I think it's important to mention that this movie, it won 2 awards and got 4 nominations in various festivals for best documentary and everything. And it got nominated by the Russian Guild of Film Critics Awards and in Stockholm Film Festival. It actually won as best documentary in Wiesbaden Go East. And the Indie Lisboa International Independent Film Festival, it also got nominated. And it won the Doc Aviv Film Festival. It should be mentioned because even though it might seem, well, why are you just talking about this movie that is compiled archive footage, but you can see how a lot of work went into this, and it is a good movie. If you know what you're getting into and you want some sort of an inside perspective, and again, I have to compare this to, well, my Mr. Dan Carlin, my favorite podcaster, right? It's similar to the feeling that when specifically he spoke about the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, he often focused on the fact how it would be like to feel like a Roman soldier who has to fight an elephant whom he has never seen in his life before with a spear. Okay, that's insider knowledge, and this is something similar. If you know what you're going in for, and also the fact that obviously, as this is archive footage, all the people they are Soviet, and you can get like a glimpse on how everyday people looked at the period and everything, and you can get into the period and you can get this. Well, if you've read about Stalin's funeral and everything that happened there, this gives you kind of a on-the-ground perspective, and it doesn't get into details with all the politics that happened surrounding Stalin's death in the top brass and everything. It gives you this on-the-ground perspective from a person who has limited knowledge of all the reasons of Stalin's death and all the elements behind it. It makes you feel like you're there, like you're a Soviet citizen, and you're going through and experiencing this whole, well, process, I guess.
Yeah. It kind of like removes the distance of like the, basically almost 70 years since it happened. And I think part of that is like a lot of the footage is in black and white, but a lot of it is in very vivid color. And it's kind of like, I'm just not used to seeing documentary footage of that age. I mean, obviously there's Technicolor movies of that vintage, but it's very odd seeing movies that are that vivid. It just doesn't seem like this is nearly 70 years ago. I think that really kind of helps the kind of like feeling like you're there aspect. I tell you what, a sort of an experiment, I would be fascinated to see the reaction of like if you showed this to like a high school age kid who just maybe didn't know anything about the Soviet Union or Stalin or the events. I mean, I think they might struggle to sit through it, just, attention spans being what they are sometimes at that age, speaking for myself. But just like to watch all of that and then see like the kicker of like, oh yeah, this is who this guy was, and see what their response would be.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing, though. One thing that I would kind of lay on as a bit of criticism of the movie is the most tedious part for me. Truly, was the kind of the arrival of all the dignitaries from other countries. I mean, because there is a lot of repetition, and I think the movie is about 2 hours long, 2 hours and a couple of minutes, and they could have probably cut out at least a half an hour of it in a way. But on the other hand, this repetitiveness also kind of adds to the atmosphere. It adds to the fact that it's a bit of a grind, and people are going through this, and that it's kind of, it adds to the mood, I think, in some way. But yeah,
definitely.
I think that part of the movie was the weakest one because, well, it is just shots of people coming out of a plane, and they show a lot of them, but it's a bit weird. But you can at least see how Russian people traditionally greet each other, so that's nice.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird seeing all of these, like nasty communist leaders being kind of warm and friendly to their like international comrades,
and kissing each other a lot.
Well, yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's not something that you would necessarily think of if you're thinking of those guys. Kind of where to go from there though, because this.
No, like I said in our pre-recording conversation. Pro tip for like background for other podcasters there. After watching this movie, I kind of went through what my grandmother, who was 20 at the time Stalin died, what she had told me because, she lived a very long age, and I was lucky that she kept her mind very clear up until the very end, and I managed to grab a lot of stories from her. And she told me about the death of Stalin and how she remembered it. And
how old was she at the time?
20.
So, and a young adult. So,
yes, and just to put things further into context, she was also a daughter of a Lutheran preacher.
Okay.
Just saying.
Yeah, important context.
That is a bit important if you're talking about Stalin and Stalin's era, persecutions and everything, right?
Right.
But she remembered that as she was in university, just like every year on the 1st of May or any such big events, everyone was in their workplaces and everywhere forced to go outside in the street. And a lot of the things that you can see in this movie are a lot of people buying these newspapers and whatever, because, if you work at a factory or anywhere else, or if you are a student or something, you can also see in the movie where like little kids get taken to say goodbye to Stalin and they carry these potted plants, and everyone was forced out there, and they were watched so that
people... you don't want to be like, I think I'll skip it, I'll stay home.
Yeah, then you get put on the naughty list, and then the nice men from the KGB, show a special interest in your actions.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people who genuinely cried after the death of Stalin, but a lot of people, for starters, just couldn't believe that this could have happened. There was a massive, massive disbelief all around, and kind of this total lack of knowledge what would happen further on, because at that point, up until near his death, the Soviet Union had become basically a complete totalitarian regime with an absolute control of Stalin, who ran everything personally, and everyone just associated Stalin with the Soviet Union so much that everyone was just kind of stunned and didn't even know how to react or what to do. And the whole confusion thing is very vivid here, and I remember that there's also this scene where military people are also walking in to say goodbye to Stalin in Moscow, and you can just see in people's faces the fact that you can just feel that some of them are there, even though they've been dragged there, but some of them are literally interested to go there and actually see if he's dead. What if this is some weird plan? And people are truly kind of just stunned, and they because my grandmother really said that people didn't believe what they were hearing in the radio, and they actually bought these newspapers, and at one point at the beginning, a lot of people actually thought that this is just a kind of a trick to see who would be happy about this, and this is kind of that Stalin had faked his own death to check on his political enemies, and then he would come back and just deal with them later or something, and it was just this weird thing.
That does seem like something that he would do. Yeah. And just with the personality cult, he was just built up. And I mean, as an illustration of a personality cult, this film is superlative, but just, he was built up to being more than human. And you just have the irony of at his funeral. So he is literally dead. We see his body. People are repeatedly using the phrase, the immortal Stalin. It's no, clearly very mortal.
No, and think about this cult of personality, and why I really love the scenes which were not from Moscow or the bigger cities, which were from very rural areas, is the fact that one thing that Stalin did as an organizer is that he introduced literacy to a lot of these places, because literacy rates were extremely low in the Russian Empire in general. They were extremely low throughout most of modern-day Russia and rural areas. And let me remind you that, for example, up until 1980s, people who worked in kolkhozs in these rural areas, these collective farms, they didn't even have passports, and they had to get party permission to even leave their district to go somewhere. It was kind of still very serf-like, but he decided that for this Soviet propaganda to work, the people needed to be able to read. So he basically fought illiteracy by just giving people his own works. A lot of people learned how to read in the Soviet Union, and mostly in the eastern parts, in Siberia and other rural towns, from reading literally Stalin's own works and all this communist propaganda. And that also helped all this cult of personality process, because if your first interaction with any written text at all comes from this one point of view, and you are like, otherwise you might be quite distant from politics, if your first ever iteration comes from all this, then it also helps to cement this cult of personality a lot.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's being almost like built into like the foundations of your subconscious, if you like.
Yeah, it kind of forms the way that you think. It kind of also reminded me of what I have seen and read about Lenin's funeral. But Stalin's funeral was interesting because how people were reacting and everything. As like Lenin's funeral was not as orchestrated, if you know what I mean. I mean, this looked specifically when you get to kind of the later parts of the movie where people are giving those speeches there. That's the one aspect where you can clearly see the fear part, because those speeches that you hear, and well, if you understand Russian, then you'll definitely know what I mean. But if you don't, then well, most of the speeches given at the end at the Stalin's funeral are kind of not even quite about Stalin at all. They mention Stalin, and they say that he was the greatest leader ever to walk this earth, of course, and but they also kind of focus on the fact that now we must build communism for Stalin, and now that we must work to complete 5-year plans and whatever, and it's perfectly normal to give a very loud kind of speech, very theatrical one, about how now we must grow more potatoes so that we continue proud Stalin's work or something. And it all looks so... It really looks kind of staged and faked. It doesn't, feel kind of nice and normal. And you can compare there the speeches given kind of by your average person, because there are some, and then at the parade, the big speeches given by the leaders are just... And if you know the background on how they're at that point already struggling to get their hands on Stalin's various papers and various, dark deeds that they have done in his secret papers and everything, and how they're already basically dealing with all the political machinations, then these speeches at the end by the other Soviet leaders, they come off as massively hypocritical and just super staged and very plasticky. It also
Sure, of course.
I hope what I'm saying makes sense, because it's quite hard to comment on all this situation there, because this is it's a very specific movie. I liked it, but I'm a Soviet history fan, and I know the whole situation there.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to get a bit more into what your grandmother had told you about her memories, because obviously, with her background being what it was, did she say that she remembered feeling relief, or was it kind of like a mixture of things?
At the beginning, it was disbelief, and then kind of, well, a lot of people in the territories that were shall we say, annexed and grabbed by Stalin after World War II, like the Baltic states or Poland or Bulgaria. Yeah, where we already had our stuff. It was more of a relief, but it also was, it was less organic, but it was more organized, because when people went out in the street and were told to basically, you must mourn now, they weren't told how long they should mourn. And my grandma ended up having to stand out in the street, and there was a pretty cold year that year, 1953.
Yeah, it's happening in March, which is, it's not warm at that point.
It's pretty cold up here, yeah. And she said that everyone was so afraid to stop openly crying and mourning on the street, and just that she had to stand there and pretend to mourn for 2 hours, because everyone was afraid that if they're going to be the first ones to go home, then they might get in trouble. And everyone just stood there, and the more they stood there, the colder it became, and everyone just didn't know what to do. Because at that point, even the whole organization and all the local party leaders, they also were scrambling. And at the beginning, there was this idea that someone who would come come in power, they would continue the Stalin's thing, and you had to show your respect for Stalin as much as you could. And then just a little later, Khrushchev turns everything around, and now Stalin's evil. And then that also causes confusion, because now everyone who's a local party leader is afraid that they showed too much respect for Stalin during his funeral.
Yeah. And it's like, I was just trying to do what I thought was the best thing for my survival at the time, and now that might be held against me. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, that is the really hard to believe, almost, that, like, within 3 years of this massive outpouring of, like, staged managed grief, it's like, yeah, so that guy that we were saying was the best thing ever, actually, he wasn't. He was quite bad, and we need to kind of put that behind us. Communism is still good, just Stalin, not so much.
The interesting part is the fact that the biggest Stalin denouncers, including Khrushchev himself, they also participated in Stalin's atrocities too, because Khrushchev,
incredibly complicit. Yeah,
it's just that it was a thing that, you know, they started fighting over who would be the top dog, and they knew that whomever won this internal political struggle would definitely pull out and use the bad deeds of whomever was the loser of this political battle to just jail them instantly, because everyone knew everyone was guilty of something, okay? So Khrushchev used this card to basically wipe the slate clean for everyone just a bit and make sure everyone could just calm down. Just did. It wasn't us, it was all Stalin. Yes, let's now.
It was all Stalin.
Yes,
so...
like we didn't do anything. Now everyone else in the Central Committee, please agree. And everyone is like, uh-huh. Of course, yes.
What wasn't me, Governor. It was all those other guys who are now conveniently dead. So it's fine. Nothing to see here. Let's move along. Let's continue building communism and the bright future. And yeah,
and just
no one look too closely.
Yeah, but like about this movie, yeah, like I said, like you said, there is not that much to comment on this one, because in an audio format, you can't really give the feel of how people look, because this is a very visual movie. It's one of those movies where there's this mood and everything, and it's quite hard to describe, really, because, you know, there are no, well, except the historical great people and the political leaders, a lot of these folks are just, you know, your everyday people, and they look very Soviet.
Course.
They look very classical Soviet too. I bet that a lot of them were a bit propped up and wear their best clothes and everything for the archive materials, because, you know, you had to do that. But
well, yeah. Like, again, you're conscious that you're being watched, and you don't want to go to the great man's funeral whilst, like, you know, looking sloppy and like you didn't try. You know, that would be seen as a sign of disrespect.
And this also kind of shows how Soviet TV worked and how Soviet media worked, because unlike in modern days, where, you know, most countries have a nice little freedom of press, during the Soviet era there was only positive news. And this also kind of shows that they did take their time and worked quite hard to show this Stalin's funeral, and they tried to make it look as pleasing to the eye and kind of respectful and dignified as possible. Because, yeah, everything in the Soviet media that was either in radio or the press or whatever, it was all focused on that everything is always good and in order in Soviet Union.
Yeah, and just getting better and better.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to show a funeral of the leader and make it look like something positive, so they had to show all this massive respect for everyone. But yeah, Stalin's funeral was basically the last funeral in the Soviet Union that happened this way, because up until, like, when Khrushchev resigns, and he didn't, like, he also had a funeral, but Khrushchev resigned, and people just at that point when Khrushchev resigned, you know, what had happened was what happens with old totalitarian regimes, that they kind of mellow out a bit and people just pay lip service, but like the fanaticism has died down, and people know that, well, we can't really get out of this, but we Now we need to say that communism is great. Okay, then and then political jokes start appearing, and there's like everyone's a bit less afraid, and nothing as pompous as this had happened. And after this, people just this was kind of the last very big funerals as massive. Of course, Brezhnev and Chernenko and Andropov also had like big funerals, but nothing as huge as what happened with Stalin, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, Brezhnev had a long tenure as leader, but he wasn't around for like basically 3 decades. And yeah, I think there was elements of personality cult stuff going on with him too, but just like not to the same extent.
Well, Brezhnev used to hold the title for like one of the longer leading people, but well, Putin has beaten Brezhnev at this point, so
Yeah, it's very weird to think that he's been around since I was in secondary school.
Yeah, it's just so weird, but
yeah, that's the way it goes.
See, this is an interesting question because normally we're at a point where I kind of, as in everything about movies, people would ask, well, do we recommend this movie? And I think the question this time is a bit different. To whom we would recommend this movie?
Ooh, that's a difficult question, because, like, in a way, I want to say, well, everyone should see this.
But everyone should at least take a look at it, but I think that your average person will probably skip over a lot of parts of it.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of a big ask, but I think the contemporary, like, relevance of personality cults around a leader, naming no names, but I think people can probably fill in the blanks with, their favourite candidates. But yeah, I think it is obviously, that is a thing to consider. Is like there is historical precedents for these things that happen in the present, and maybe seeing examples of it in the past, can help you understand how things are at the current time. So yeah, I'm not going to say it's an exciting watch, but I think it is worth checking out.
I would definitely check this out if you have seen The Death of Stalin, the comedy movie.
Oh, definitely.
Because this will give you, first of all, you'll understand what's happening, and this will give you so much context and make you understand kind of the punch of the dark comedy in The Death of Stalin a lot more. Because then you'll have a lot of context for this, and it's not played for laughs at all, and this kind of somber not. And this somber tone in the movie will greatly complement The Death of Stalin's kind of lighthearted tone. Because if you watch this right after that, or at least a couple of days after that, then you can like, oh, this was a funny thing. Let's see how this went, and go like,
sort of compare and contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, obviously, clearly, it's not played for laughs, but just as a person with, an odd sense of humour, I couldn't help finding certain aspects kind of like darkly funny.
Oh, yeah,
like,
of course.
Just, you mentioned like the religious persecution aspect, just the fact that you have these high dignitaries of the Orthodox Church kind of like bowing to the, paying their respects to this person who, until, as we mentioned in part 1, until the Second World War came along and Russian Orthodoxy was useful as like a rallying point, he kind of tried to stamp out their church and like persecuted their, ostensibly their friends. So that's very weird to see. But also just and this is odd. This is just me, but just his Stalin's coffin. The fact it's just so bright red, and then the fact that it has this kind of like bubble window.
Oh yeah,
where you can see his face. It's almost like he's a cosmonaut with.
Oh no! Like, the bubble window.
This fishbowl.
I have an explanation for the fishbowl window. It's so that people would actually believe that Stalin was dead. They had to see the body. Otherwise, no one would believe it. Yes.
Right.
This is his body. It's in the coffin. Yes, it is Stalin. This is not a trick. March on, comrade.
Yeah, And then his general hat is like perched on the top. It's just quite a
and it's bright
odd
red. It is
image.
It is
so red.
Can it be more red? None more red.
Yes, yeah, yes. Well, like the the Spinal Tap album cover. None more black. Yeah, it's just very, very odd thing to witness.
It kind of the feel that it gave me is when you I'm sure some listeners have played this. If you've played some indie horror games with the very creepy vibes going on, where you watch this and you sometimes feel like something's wrong. It gives you a bit of creepy vibes too now and then, and you can't really say what exactly. But yeah, that kind of gives you the mood. You're always... The movie, when I watched it, made me feel that I wanted to, turn around and watch behind me, like, because this gives you this kind of, this creepy feeling.
The feeling that you're being watched, it's very unsettling.
It is achieved, by this positioning of you in the story as, like, inside there, and that the movie really feels, because if you wanna feel how the Soviet people felt during this whole process and in general during a lot of the Soviet era, and have this kind of dread stuff and have some empathy maybe to the average Soviet person, then you should definitely give this movie a try. But like I said, I don't know if many people will watch through this in one setting, definitely. I mean, I get that. It's a thing. But it's a primary source if you're a history student. It definitely, if you have any reason in your studies or your hobbies to, be interested about how it really was like, or if you study Soviet history or just Cold War history in general, then definitely you should watch this. Absolutely.
Yeah, and just getting that kind of like emotional, full-on, this is as close as you can get to actually being there. Yeah, that's definitely like valuable. Okay, well, I feel like this is a good place to wrap up the episode. Thank you, Kristaps, so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. So before we go, where can folks find you online?
Oh, we're having a bit of an issue with our homepage at this moment. It's going to come back up. It's theeasternborder.lv, because we have to deal with some technical issues. However, you can find me on, every good place you can listen to podcasts. We're on Spotify and all your podcasting apps, and just look up The Eastern Border or just Eastern Border Podcast, and hey, you'll find us. Then you can listen to us. And we're also on Twitter. If you follow Alistair on any of his accounts, you'll probably find me on the friends list too. It's not hard. It's the Eastern Border. Yep. We communicate now and then on Twitter too, and we do
indeed.
And we also respond to our listeners, which is also no less important. So you can find us there. So yeah, if you want to listen, more about Soviet history or Russian politics, then please do check out The Eastern Border. That's my show, and I hope you'll find it interesting. And I'm extremely thankful to you for having me on here and for showing me this movie, because for me it was extremely interesting and kind of an emotional trip that made me think a lot more. And like I said, I had heard stories and watched some other kind of archive documentaries of the whole era, but in a sense, I guess I kind of understand my late grandmother a bit more, at least from this event, because it one thing that it does give you is this insider perspective. Yeah,
wonderful. I'm so glad that I don't want to say you had a good time, but that you found like that it was a valuable experience. So
no, comrade. Comrade, what do you mean we didn't have a good time?
Right? Yes. No. Sorry. Happiness is mandatory, of course. All right. Yeah. Хорошо. Okay, so yeah, on that note, thank you very much for listening, and до свидания, folks.
До свидания, товарищи.
So So that's it for this episode, but before I go, I'd like to thank Sasha Ilukovic and the Highly Skilled Migrants for the use of their song Cold in our intro. You can find that song and the rest of their back catalogue on Bandcamp and Spotify. If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting us by leaving a rating at Apple Podcasts or at podchaser.com. That second one, Podchaser, even lets you rate individual episodes, so if this episode particularly stood out to you, you can let other listeners know that you enjoyed it. Recommending the show on social media is hugely helpful as well. If you can spare a moment or two to do that, it would really make my day. Thank you very much. Speaking of social media, please find us and say hi on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. You can also drop us a line at rusefalesunite@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, take care of yourselves, and bye for now. Don't forget that you can get an entire month of incredible cinema for free when you visit mubi.com/rusophiles. That's mubi.com/rusophiles.